At exactly 2:30 a.m., three shadows appeared at the iron gate of the parking lot. Under the dim glow of the street lamps, their silhouettes shifted restlessly. The largest of them, broad-shouldered and moving with confidence, pointed toward the payment kiosk in the far corner. The second, younger-looking and gripping a screwdriver, crept slowly toward the security booth. The third smirked when he caught sight of the old night guard on duty. This would be easy. Or so they thought. None of them knew that John Carter was about to touch the old badge in his pocket for the first time in 30 years. The neighborhood was asleep. A few faint lights glowed from scattered windows, while the wind stirred the leaves, breaking the silence of the night. John Carter, 62 years old, with a gray beard and weary eyes, stood in front of the booth. His coat was worn, his shoes scuffed, yet his posture carried an odd sense of peace, as if this night would be no different than all the others. The flashlight in his hand swept across the corners of the lot at steady intervals, continuing his routine. He had been in this job for 15 years. In those 15 years, nothing had ever happened. The three thieves exchanged knowing glances as they reviewed their plan one final time. The largest, Mark, directed the group with the authority of past robberies. Beside him, Sam, just 19, trembled with adrenaline. The third, David, in his 30s with a prior record, had proven himself before. None of them had the slightest idea who the old guard really was. All they saw was the money inside the machine, and the man blocking their way seemed too trivial to matter. As John moved slowly, shining his flashlight across the cars one by one, his steps were deliberate but firm. Every action was measured, every glance positioned to cover his surroundings. Habits drilled into him decades ago still lived within him. The weight of his past revealed itself not only in old photographs, but in every move he made. No one noticed. Perhaps no one wanted to. Mark gave a silent signal to the others. The plan was simple. Sam would open the machine, David would distract the guard, and Mark would keep watch. Everything was under control. They didn't expect the old man to put up a fight. 5 minutes. No more. Then they would vanish on their motorbikes. What they hadn't accounted for was the badge in John Carter's pocket and the memories tied to it. David made the first move. He slipped through the entrance and headed toward the booth. John noticed immediately. He turned his flashlight, but to their surprise, he didn't panic. He simply stood and waited. His eyes tracked David while his ears searched for the faintest sound around him. 2 more men. Their positions were clear, though they hadn't yet advanced. As David drew closer, he softened his voice, assuming the guard's age meant poor hearing. But the sharp clarity in those eyes unsettled him. Despite the years, this man's gaze was razor-sharp, unblinking. David hesitated. Maybe this wasn't going to be as easy as they had imagined. Meanwhile, Sam crouched by the machine and pressed his screwdriver against the metal surface. He tried to keep it quiet, but scratching noises echoed faintly as he worked. Mark stood by the gate, scanning the street. Everything was moving, according to plan, until John Carter acted in a way they hadn't foreseen. Because John wasn't just watching. He was analyzing. With instincts carved into him years ago, he studied their movements. 3 men. Exits under control. Weapons? Still uncertain. But their body language gave them away. They lacked experience. Especially the boy at the machine. Too hasty. That worked in John's favor. If you're curious about how this story continues, don't forget to hit the like button. Because tonight, John Carter's life was about to change forever. David now stood beside the guard. When he spoke, his voice cracked with unease. John remained silent, listening, though his eyes were in constant motion. That unsettled David. Why was the old man so calm? Why wasn't he panicking or trying to call for help? In John's pocket, the old badge pressed warmly against his fingers. 25 years earlier, when he retired, he had touched it for what he thought would be the last time. He never imagined he would need it again. but life sometimes forced a man to confront who he used to be. Tonight was one of those nights. David's tone grew sharper. The guard's calmness was driving him mad. He stepped closer and laid a hand on John's shoulder. What happened next stunned him. John's reflexes were lightning fast. The hand on his shoulder was brushed away as if struck by a jolt of electricity. The movement was so natural, so controlled, that David barely understood what had happened. This old man's reactions were far sharper than normal. Meanwhile, Sam struggled with the machine. The screwdriver slipped, scratching metal but achieving nothing. His inexperience was showing. The marks deepened, but the lock refused to budge. Sweat slid down his forehead. This was far harder than he had imagined. He glanced toward Mark, signaling for help, but Mark was still watching the street. As John deflected David's touch, the training buried deep within him began to resurface. His reflexes had kicked in automatically. Yet it wasn't time to strike. Not yet. He needed to confirm the position of all three men. From the corner of his eye, he tracked the boy at the machine, while his ears searched for Mark's movements. Everything was under control, but the moment to reveal his hand had not yet arrived. David pulled back, this time raising his voice. The guard's silence infuriated him. The calm look in John's eyes gave the impression that he already knew everything. It was driving David paranoid. Had this man seen them coming? Had he already called the police? These thoughts swirled in his head, but John's expression never changed. Mark, after confirming the street was clear, turned back to check on his crew. He saw Sam still fumbling with the machine, and David locked in a strange standoff with the guard. The plan was unraveling. He quickened his steps, moving inside. A more aggressive approach was needed. John sensed the third man approaching. Heavy, hurried footsteps. This one had to be the leader. His stance, the confidence he carried it, gave him away. The true test was about to begin. John's flashlight still shone, but it was no longer just a tool. It was a weapon. Techniques drilled into him decades ago flooded back into his mind. Mark stepped in front of John, his voice carrying authority. He now understood why David was struggling. This old man was different. There was no fear in his eyes, only a calculated patience. Mark had never seen anything like it. Most people would panic, tremble, but John Carter stood there as if he were meditating. When Sam's efforts at the machine failed, Mark went to help. Realizing the screwdriver was useless, he pulled a small hammer from his pocket. But the sound it made was far louder. Each strike rang out against the metal, echoing through the still night. John heard the noise and knew the time had come. That sound could wake the neighbors, and then things would spiral out of control. John slowly switched off his flashlight. The sudden motion caught all three thieves off guard. Darkness swallowed the parking lot, leaving only the distant glow of the street lamps. But for John, this was no problem. Night vision was a habit carved into him decades ago. His eyes adapted instantly. The advantage was his now. David stumbled back in panic at the sudden darkness. Mark fumbled to switch on the flashlight on his phone, but he couldn't locate John's position. Sam stayed crouched by the machine, but the hammer slipped from his hand and clattered against the pavement. The metallic echo rang loud in the still night. Everything had changed. If you're following this story, stay tuned, because John Carter's true identity was about to be revealed. Using the cover of darkness, John moved silently. His steps were so precise that not a sound betrayed him. Techniques from night operations 25 years ago still lived in his body. His first target was Sam by the machine. The boy was the least experienced, easy to neutralize. Controlling his breathing, John closed in. Mark swung his phone's light across the lot, but still couldn't find him. Panic started to rise. How could an old man move so quickly? Had they underestimated him all along? Mark called out for David, but there was no answer. David too had lost track of where John was. Sam crouched, trying to see around him, searching for where the hammer had fallen. Just then, he felt a light touch on the back of his neck. Before he could turn, pressure pinned him down expertly. He found himself on the ground, stunned. John had disabled him, but without harm. The boy was simply immobilized. Mark heard the faint scuffle from Sam's direction and rushed over. But John was already 2 steps ahead. He moved like a shadow in the dark. David pressed himself against a wall, peering into the darkness with growing fear. He had no phone, and Mark's light was too far. Alone in the dark, he was vulnerable. John's second strike was aimed at David. He closed in silently, and with one swift move, brought him down as well. David tried to resist, but the strength of the older man shocked him. Age had deceived them all. This man was far stronger, far more skilled than he appeared. Gasping on the ground, he realized he was beaten, but not hurt. Now only Mark remained. His phone light swept across the lot, and he saw both of his friends on the ground, unmoving but breathing. But John was nowhere in sight. Fear surged through him. This wasn't an ordinary night guard. He shouted into the darkness, but only his own echo came back. Mark's hand trembled, the phone shaking in his grip. Fear and adrenaline coursed through him. His 2 friends were down, alive but incapacitated. That alone told him something terrifying. This man wasn't trying to kill them. He was controlling them. That meant professional training. Thousands of questions stormed his mind. Who was this old man, really? From the shadows, John studied him. The young man's panic was obvious. The phone light was irritating. It stripped away his advantage in the dark. He moved in cautiously. Mark was different from the others, more experienced. His stance and scanning movements gave him away. This final step had to be planned carefully. Mark backed slowly away from the wall, inching toward the exit gate. Step by step, he retreated. But John had already anticipated this. The exit was cut off. When Mark shone his light forward, there he was, John Carter, standing in front of the gate, hands clasped behind his back, watching him with calm eyes. There was no way out now. Mark's voice cracked when he tried to speak, the words catching in his throat. The calmness in John's gaze infuriated him. How could this man remain so composed? Desperately, Mark pulled out a pocket knife. Maybe it would give him courage, maybe scare the old man. But John's face didn't change. He looked at the knife, then locked eyes with him again. When John saw the knife, a memory flashed in his mind. 28 years earlier, during an operation overseas, a hostile had faced him with a similar blade. Even then, he had remained calm. Men who carried knives were often inexperienced. The real danger came from those who struck silently. Mark's trembling hand gave him away. He was new to this. Mark stepped forward, holding the knife out toward John, but his steps were uncertain. The old man's stillness rattled him. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't retreating. He was simply waiting. That calmness shook what little confidence Mark had left. Maybe this man really was dangerous. Maybe this whole plan had been a mistake, one realized far too late. John recognized the hesitation. This was his chance. In his mind, he recalled the close combat techniques drilled into him years ago. There were dozens of ways to deal with a knife attack. The most effective? Wait, and strike at the right moment. When Mark stepped closer, John was ready. Mark finally lunged, swinging the blade. But John was already moving. With a sidestep, he evaded the strike and seized Mark's wrist in one fluid motion. The move was so quick, Mark barely understood what had happened. The knife slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. John's grip was firm but not painful. He wasn't trying to injure him, only to control him. Mark realized he was completely in the old man's hands. His strength was unbelievable. How could someone this age be so powerful? He struggled, but every attempt seemed anticipated, countered before it even began. It was as if John could read his mind. This level of control came only from years of elite training. Mark now knew this was no ordinary night guard. Once he had Mark restrained, John began to speak. His voice was calm, but its authority was unmistakable. He told him he wouldn't be harmed, only held until the police arrived. From his tone alone, Mark could tell this man was trained. His word choice, his composure, everything pointed to a professional. Unable to contain his curiosity, Mark asked who he was, and how he could fight like that. After a long silence, John answered. He was a retired officer from a special response unit, having served 25 years in high-risk operations, counter-terrorism, hostage rescues, narcotics raids. He had been through it all. When he retired, he sought peace and chose the quiet life of a security guard. Mark was stunned. Why would someone with such a background take this job? John's reply was simple. Service had always been his philosophy. As a cop, he served his country. Now, he served his neighborhood. Protecting people was his purpose. Age was just a number. What mattered was experience and resolve. By then, Sam and David were regaining consciousness. Dazed but unharmed, they remembered how easily he had taken them down. It was clear this man was no ordinary guard. Their legs shook as they stood, but they could move. John assured them he hadn't meant to hurt them. Reaching into his pocket, John pulled out his old badge. The metal was tarnished by years, but the words were still legible. Special Response Division, Police Department, citations for distinguished service. Mark's jaw dropped. The weight of John's past was far heavier than they had imagined. In an instant, everything made sense. John slipped the badge back into his pocket and looked at the three young men. He began to speak to them not as enemies, but as someone who understood. He knew the recklessness of youth, but he also knew the cost of wrong choices. Life gained meaning only through the right decisions. Crime might offer quick rewards, but in the long run, it only delivered pain. They were still young. They still had time to change. As Mark listened to John's words, a strange sense of respect stirred inside him. This man hadn't beaten them down or called for backup. He was giving them advice. Only someone with true strength of character would do that. Maybe they really had chosen the wrong path. Maybe this night was a turning point. From the distance came the wail of police sirens. John smiled the moment he heard them. He had called earlier, and the units were on their way. But he decided to give the three young men one last chance. If they walked away now, he would tell the officers it was only suspicious loitering, not an attempted robbery. That would spare them from serious charges. The three were stunned by the offer. No one treated caught thieves this way, yet the sincerity in John's eyes cut through their shock. Mark looked at his friends and saw they were thinking the same thing. They couldn't waste this chance. They thanked him and hurried off into the night. John watched them go, catching one last glance over their shoulders. Regret and gratitude glimmered in their eyes. Perhaps this night truly marked the beginning of a change for them. Over the years, he had arrested many criminals, but he had never let anyone go like this. Age, however, had taught him empathy and mercy. When the patrol cars arrived at the lot, John met the officers. He explained the situation, but softened the details. He told them the youths had been hanging around suspiciously, but after a warning, they left. The officers trusted him. He was a former colleague, and he had always been honest. The report was filed, and the matter was closed. After the cruisers departed, silence once again settled over the lot. John stood at the booth, reflecting on the night. 15 years he had worked this post, and never had he faced something like this. What surprised him most wasn't the encounter itself, but how sharp his old reflexes still were. It was as if his body had been waiting in reserve since retirement. Tonight, that waiting had ended. Around 5 in the morning, it was time for the shift change. The young guard scheduled to relieve him, Michael, as usual, arrived early. He always treated John with respect. He had learned much from his experience. But this morning, John's face carried a different expression, as if a heavy burden he had carried for years had finally lifted. When Michael asked how the night had gone, John's reply sounded like a routine report. Nothing unusual, a quiet night. But the spark in his eyes told a different story. Michael often wondered about the stories hidden in this man's past, but he never asked out of respect for boundaries. Walking home, John's stride felt different. There was resolve in his steps, like the old days. The badge in his pocket was warm beneath his fingers. After 25 years, he had touched it again, and that touch had reminded him of who he was. Age hadn't weakened him, it had simply steered him down another road. But when needed, he could still be the John Carter of old. At home, he brewed his coffee and turned on the television. The news droned on about routine thefts, youth crimes, and economic troubles. What he had experienced that night was just one piece of a much larger problem. Young people were desperate, the future uncertain, shortcuts tempting. Yet there was always another option. The right one. Across the city, Mark lay awake, unable to sleep. The night replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the second chance John Carter had given them. Why had such a simple act of mercy shaken him so deeply? Maybe because no one had trusted him in a long time. Maybe that trust could change him. Sam and David were having similar thoughts. That night had marked a turning point in their lives. In the very moment they believed themselves strong, they realized just how weak they truly were. Yet they had also discovered that strength came in other forms, like standing tall in silence, with calm determination, just as John Carter had done. That morning, Mark called his friends. He wanted to meet. There was too much to talk about. The previous night hadn't only been about an attempted robbery. It had forced them to question the direction of their lives. They couldn't let that reflection slip away. Perhaps they had met the right man at exactly the right time. That afternoon, the three of them gathered at a small cafe in their neighborhood. The conversation quickly circled back to the same subject: John Carter. His behavior wasn't normal. An ordinary guard would have called the police and had them arrested. Instead, he had shown mercy, and that mercy had shaken them. Mark proposed something new to his friends. They should walk away from crime entirely. The underworld promised easy money, but in the end, it destroyed everyone. There were other ways to prove themselves. They could work, study, build normal lives. John Carter had given them that chance. Sam hesitated at first. His family's financial situation was dire, and he needed fast money. But the fear he had felt that night lingered. The calm in John's eyes had shown him where true strength came from. Strength wasn't about crushing others. It was about controlling yourself. David was even more affected. John's physical strength had shocked him, but it was the man's character that left the deepest mark. To be that calm, that steady at his age, required years of discipline and experience. Perhaps one day, he could become a man like that too, but it would mean making the right choices. Starting now, they made their decision. They would leave crime behind for good. Mark would begin working at his father's auto repair shop. Sam would return to the school he had dropped out of. David would look for honest work. It wouldn't be easy, but that night had taught them a truth. The easy path was rarely the right one. That weekend, the three made an unexpected decision. They wanted to visit John Carter, to thank him, to apologize, and to share their new resolve. They found his house and knocked on the door. John was surprised to see them, but welcomed them inside. His home was simple, but orderly. The walls held old photographs John in uniform, snapshots with teammates after missions, memories from award ceremonies. These images revealed just how full his past had been. The young men were even more impressed as they looked around. Mark explained their decision. They were done with crime and had chosen to build honest lives. Hearing this, John's eyes lit up. For him, this was the most valuable outcome of that night. He had managed to change the course of 3 young lives. He then shared his own story. In his youth, he too had been tempted by the wrong path, but a police officer had steered him back, changing his life forever. Now, he found himself in that same role. Life, he explained, had a way of coming full circle. The young men asked for his advice. He spoke of how to rebuild, how to endure the struggles they would surely face. Every challenge, he said, was also an opportunity. A person's true character showed in the hardest times. The key was never to give up. Before they left, John gave them one final piece of advice. Always support one another. Breaking free from bad habits was never easy. They would face negative influences, but together they could withstand them. Friendship, he told them, was one of life's greatest treasures. The young men thanked him again before leaving. The visit meant more to them than they could express. John, too, was glad. In retirement, having such a meaningful impact on others gave him a joy beyond measure. Months passed. Mark began working at his father's repair shop and grew to love it. His hands were dirty, but his conscience was clean. Sam returned to school and focused on his studies. David found a job at a grocery chain and worked tirelessly. Each of them was finally putting their life on track. Meanwhile, John continued his duty as a night guard, but now with a different motivation. He wasn't just protecting buildings, he was protecting people. His past experience hadn't gone to waste. He was still making a difference. Age was only a number. What mattered was the drive in his heart. A year later, the three young men visited John again. This time, they came with stories of success. Mark had been offered a partnership at the shop. Sam was excelling in school and preparing for college. David had become a store manager. All three of them saw that night as the turning point of their lives. As John listened, he smiled with pride. This was his greatest achievement. He had changed their lives, guided them onto the right path. It was more valuable than any medal, because true success was touching the lives of others. What does this story mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like the video so it reaches more people. Because in every life, there is a John Carter. Either we recognize him, or we wait for him to recognize us. After that night, John Carter no longer sat in the guard booth dwelling on the past. Instead, he thought about the future. How many more lives could he touch? How many more young men could he steer away from the wrong road? Retirement wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something new. In the silence of the night, when the city seemed to pause and breathe, John Carter sat at his post. The badge in his pocket no longer felt like a burden. He had proven himself worthy of carrying it. Some people, when they retire, leave the past behind. Others carry it into the future, giving it even deeper meaning. And so, the story of a quiet parking lot guard became the beginning of 3 new lives. Because real heroes don't boast they step forward, only when they are needed. And that night, John Carter did exactly that.